Religious conversations aren't always conversations. A lot of the time, they're performances. Not in a theatrical sense, but in the way people often use them to defend an identity, not a position. That's what makes them complicated. You're not just dealing with ideas. You're dealing with someone's worldview, their social network, their memories, their moral code, maybe even their fear of death. And so if you're someone who doesn't hold religious beliefs, it's easy to feel boxed in. You want to stay honest, but also avoid sounding hostile. You want to be respectful, but not passive. You want to challenge poor reasoning without attacking the person. And that's the real tension. It's tempting to want to win these discussions, but most religious arguments don't have clear winners. They're not like debates about science or policy where evidence can shift the outcome. They're loaded with untestable assumptions, and that's by design. So handling them well isn't just about knowing facts, it's about knowing psychology. Let's start there. When someone brings up religion, what are they really doing? Often they're trying to affirm something. Maybe their values, maybe their fears. Sometimes they're just repeating what they've always heard, but very rarely are they inviting you to break it down. Most people don't present their beliefs expecting them to be questioned, especially not at the foundation. So if you respond with a hard counter like, "That's not true," or "That makes no sense," the conversation doesn't go deeper, it just shuts down. You'll usually see a wall go up. And not just any wall, a reinforced moral wall, because you've now challenged something sacred. Not because what you said was wrong, but because it wasn't expected. The key is, don't walk into these conversations thinking you're diffusing a bomb. You're not. But you're also not trying to set one off. You're creating a space where ideas can breathe, even uncomfortable ones. You're inviting someone to examine what they believe, not to defend it on instinct. That takes a different kind of approach, less about being clever, more about being clear. A lot of religious arguments rest on generalities. There must be something, or without God there's no meaning, or you can't prove God doesn't exist. These aren't real conclusions. They're placeholders. They sound deep until you ask for specifics. And that's where you can start, not by arguing back immediately, but by staying calm and asking, what do you mean by that? What does something refer to? What kind of meaning are we talking about? What exactly is the God you're referring to? Because until that's clear, there's no argument to even respond to. This doesn't just slow things down, it reveals how much of religion survives on vague concepts. Concepts that are easy to repeat but hard to define. Take the first cause argument, the idea that the universe must have come from something so that something must be God. It sounds logical, right? But dig a little and it falls apart. Why assume that cause was a conscious being? Why not an unknown force or a natural condition beyond our universe? Why stop at one God? Why not two? Why not none? These are not gotcha questions. They're reminders that every answer religion gives just raises more questions, and instead of exploring them, religion tends to stop the conversation at "God did it." That's not an explanation, it's a shortcut. And shortcuts might feel satisfying, but they don't get you very far. Another common tactic is moral anchoring. Without religion, where do you get your morality? The implication here is that morals come from the top down, that if there's no divine rule book, people will just do whatever they want. But we know this doesn't hold up. First, religious texts contradict themselves constantly. Even within a single tradition like Christianity, you have verses calling for love and others endorsing violence, slavery, or obedience over reason. If that's where morality comes from, then morality is whatever you choose to quote. Second, secular societies consistently rank higher on measures of well-being, lower crime, higher education, more gender equality, better health care. These aren't accidents. They reflect systems where empathy, reason, and shared responsibility guide behavior. not fear of punishment or divine judgment. But even more than data, there's this simple truth. If you need a holy book to tell you not to kill or steal, you're not moral, you're obedient. And obedience isn't the same as ethics. Still, religious arguments often don't budge on this. They don't just say that religion supports morality, they say it grounds it. That without belief in a higher power, all values become subjective. But here's the catch. Religion is already subjective. What you believe usually depends on where you were born, what language you speak, and who raised you. That's not universal truth, that's cultural conditioning. And that's where things get delicate, because pointing this out feels personal to people. It makes them feel like their most cherished views are just accidents of geography. But that doesn't make it any less true. If someone had been born in Mecca instead of Missouri, they'd probably be Muslim, not Christian. That's not an insult, that's just statistics. So when someone insists their religion is the one true faith, you don't have to attack it. Just hold it up next to all the others. Ask how they know theirs is right and the others are wrong. Ask what evidence they'd accept that their belief might be mistaken. If the answer is none, that tells you everything you need to know. Because a belief you're unwilling to question isn't a belief, it's a shield. And this is why religious arguments often go in circles, not because they're complicated, but because they're built to resist scrutiny. They're wrapped in emotion, identity, and fear, and when you pull at the logic, you're pulling at all three. But here's the thing, you don't have to dismantle someone's worldview in one conversation. That's not the goal. In fact, trying to do that usually backfires. What you can do is introduce doubt, not in a hostile way, but in a way that lingers, in a way they remember later when they're alone with their thoughts. That's where change starts, not in debate halls, not on social media, but in quiet moments, when someone realizes the answers they've been told don't quite add up anymore. And that's what makes handling religious arguments so tricky and so important. People rarely change their minds out loud. Most shifts in belief are slow, subtle, and internal. That's why your role in these conversations isn't to force an epiphany, it's to plant seeds. Sometimes, just one clear question can do more than a whole hour of back and forth, but it has to be the right kind of question. Not a trap, not a rhetorical jab, a real honest inquiry that they haven't had to answer before. Questions like, what would your life look like without this belief? Or, how do you know this wasn't taught to you for reasons other than truth? These are quiet questions, but they have weight. It helps to understand the mechanisms that keep belief in place. One of the strongest is confirmation bias, the tendency to notice, remember, and interpret things in a way that supports what you already believe. It's not a flaw of religious people, it's a flaw of human brains. We all do it. But in religious thinking, it gets supercharged. Every good event is a blessing. Every close call is a miracle. Every coincidence is a sign. You can't debate someone out of confirmation bias directly. What you can do is help them see how selective it is. You can point out all the things that happen that don't fit the narrative, the unanswered prayers, the suffering of the faithful, the randomness of tragedy. You can ask, if this were happening to someone in another religion, would you see it as proof of their God? That's when it starts to unravel, not all at once, but crack by crack. Another stronghold is community. Religion often isn't just a belief system, it's a support network. It's where people find friendships, purpose, identity, even economic help. So when you challenge a belief, you're not just challenging an idea, you're pressing against a structure that holds someone's life together. And that's why these conversations can feel so charged, because to a religious person, letting go of belief might feel like losing their place in the world, not just spiritually, but socially. That's no small thing. So don't be surprised if your most rational points are met with emotion, or if someone doubles down after you've exposed a clear contradiction. It's not because you've failed. It's because belief isn't always about truth. Sometimes It's about safety. You can still be firm, you can still challenge ideas, but do it with that awareness. Don't talk at someone's beliefs, talk to the person behind them. It's also worth remembering how fluid religious belief can be, even among believers. A lot of people say they believe in God, but they don't actually follow the teachings closely. They pick and choose. They don't really think about the doctrine. What they believe in is often more like a vague trust that something's out there, not a commitment to a specific theology. And that kind of belief is slippery. It shifts when pressed. One day it's the God of the Bible, the next day it's a cosmic force of love, the day after that it's just the universe has a plan. You're not dealing with one stable idea. You're chasing a moving target. You don't have to chase it. You can pause and ask, if this belief changes every time it's questioned, is it something solid or something you're protecting? That's not condescending, that's fair. And it invites the kind of honesty most religious arguments avoid. There's also a pattern in these discussions that's hard to miss. When logic fails, many believers fall back on mystery. Well, we can't understand God's plan, or it's not supposed to make sense. It's about faith. That might feel like humility, but in reality it shuts down inquiry. It says, stop thinking here. But if something can't be explained, that's not a reason to accept it. It's a reason to keep asking questions. Mystery isn't proof, it's just a pause in understanding. And if the answer to every challenge is just have faith, then we're not dealing with a worldview that wants to be examined. We're dealing with a worldview that's armored against doubt. There's nothing wrong with not knowing, but there is something wrong with pretending that not knowing is the same as knowing something supernatural. The honest answer to a lot of these big questions, why we're here, how the universe began, what happens after death, is that we don't fully know yet. And that's okay, because I don't know is a starting point. God did it is an ending. One of the most underappreciated aspects of religious argument is how often it's built on fear. Not just fear of the unknown, but fear of consequences. Eternal consequences, heaven, hell, judgment. These are powerful motivators, and they're often built into the logic of belief itself. If you don't believe, you'll suffer. That's not an argument, that's a threat. You can point this out gently. Ask, if you didn't believe out of fear, would you still believe? Or, if your religion didn't promise reward or punishment, would you still follow it? These questions aren't just about belief, they're about motive. And motive matters, because a belief held out of fear isn't about truth, it's about survival. And that's not a reliable way to get to anything real. This is especially true in debates about the afterlife. People cling to the idea of heaven and hell because they want justice, they want closure, they want meaning in death. And religion offers a tidy solution. Everyone gets what they deserve in the end. But if we're being honest, there's no evidence for that. None. All we know is that we die, and we don't like that. So we create stories to make it feel better. Stories where death isn't really the end. Stories where the bad are punished and the good are rewarded. But a comforting story isn't automatically true. It's just comforting. And when we mistake comfort for truth, we stop growing. We settle for answers that feel good instead of answers that hold up. This is where patience really matters. Most people don't want to be lied to. They don't want to believe in things that aren't true, but they also don't want to feel like their life has been built on sand. That's a hard realization, and for some, it's just too much to face all at once. So when you're in these conversations, don't expect immediate breakthroughs. Respect the timeline. Focus on clarity, not conversion. Show that it's possible to live without belief, and not just live, but thrive. That might be the most powerful thing you can do. Not argue harder, just live well. Be thoughtful, be ethical, be curious. Because when someone sees that it's possible to be all those things without religion, that might do more than any debate ever could. Sometimes the strongest message you can send in a religious conversation isn't in what you say, it's in what you don't need. You don't need a supernatural story to be moral. You don't need ancient texts to understand compassion. You don't need a higher power to appreciate beauty, meaning, or truth. That quiet confidence can be disarming because it challenges the idea, often unspoken, that life without religion is empty, that it's all cynicism and despair. But the opposite is often true. When you stop expecting the universe to come with a script, you start writing your own. And that's something religious arguments rarely account for. They assume that without divine meaning, life is meaningless. But meaning isn't handed down, it's made. And the meaning you make yourself is often more honest, more flexible, and more durable than anything imposed from outside. When someone says, "But don't you want there to be something more?" you can say, "Sure, wanting doesn't make it real. I'd like to believe in a cosmic safety net, but I'd rather face what's true than what's comforting." That's a hard line for some people to hear, because religion is very good at selling comfort, certainty, simplicity, and real life doesn't work like that. It's messy, it's uncertain, it's full of unanswered questions. But pretending to have all the answers doesn't make you wise, it makes you dishonest. You'll notice this pattern in many religious arguments, the attempt to reframe doubt as a weakness. You don't believe? That means you're lost or angry or rebellious. The assumption is that if you walk away from faith, it must be because something's wrong with you, not the belief. That's not a conversation, that's a defense mechanism. And you don't have to absorb that kind of framing. You can calmly explain that asking questions isn't a sign of rebellion, it's a sign of curiosity. That changing your mind when the evidence changes isn't weakness, it's integrity. Sometimes you'll hear people say, "Well, what's the harm? Even if it's not true, religion makes people better." That's the so-called noble lie argument. The idea that belief, even if false, has utility. But this argument ignores the actual damage done by religious ideas, not just historically, but now. It ignores the people turned away from their families because of who they love, the children raised to fear eternal torment, the laws written to enforce someone else's doctrine. And even in its mildest forms, this mindset still promotes the idea that truth is optional, that comfort is more important than accuracy. That's not noble. That's condescending. Truth matters, not just because it's true, but because what we build on it is more stable, more compassionate, and more adaptable than any belief propped up by fear or tradition. Another idea you'll hear is the fine-tuning argument, that the universe is so precisely calibrated for life that it must have been designed. But that flips the logic completely. It's not that the universe was made for life. It's that life adapted to the universe. Of course, it seems perfectly tuned after the fact. That's like throwing a dart at a wall and then drawing a bullseye around it. When people point to the complexity of life as proof of a creator, it's worth asking, why is complexity evidence of design? Why not randomness or natural selection or time? Complexity doesn't require intent. It just requires enough iterations. And that brings up another tool you can use in these conversations: scale. Religious ideas often collapse when you zoom out, when you look at the size of the universe, the number of galaxies, the depth of time. The idea that it was all created for us starts to feel oddly small. It's not that humans are meaningless, it's that we're not central. We're not the reason for everything. And that realization, instead of making life feel empty, can actually make it more profound. Because meaning that comes from being special is fragile. But meaning that comes from awareness, connection, and creation, that's something you can build on. That said, don't underestimate how strong the pull of specialness is. Religion tells people they're chosen, that they're known by name, that they're watched over, guided, protected. Letting go of that idea can feel like falling into a void. It can feel cold. But it's not. What it is honest. And when you start having these conversations with people, you'll start to see how many of their arguments aren't really about God at all. They're about identity. They're about meaning. They're about fear. Strip away the language, and what you're often left with is this: I want the world to make sense. I want to feel safe. I want to belong. Those are real needs. But supernatural answers aren't the only way to meet them. You can find community without dogma. You can find purpose without prophecy. You can face mortality without myth. The difference is it takes more work. Religion offers a ready-made story. Living without that script means writing your own. But it's also more free, more flexible, more honest. And once people see that, many of them start asking better questions. They start looking under the surface. They start reconsidering the things they were told never to doubt. That's the real power of a good religious conversation. Not to win, not to destroy, but to unlock. To show someone that there's a way out of the fog, not into emptiness, but into clarity. And often that starts not by arguing, but by listening. By showing that your perspective isn't hostile, just thoughtful. That you don't need to convert anyone, you just want them to think more carefully about the things they've never questioned. That's where the shift begins. Slowly, quietly, but deeply. There's one more thing that often goes unspoken in religious discussions. The idea that belief is harmless if it's private. If someone wants to believe in miracles or angels or divine plans, and it makes them feel better, who's it hurting? On the surface, that feels fair, and sometimes it is. But belief shapes behavior, and behavior shapes societies. Even private faith informs how people vote, how they raise their children, how they respond to science, medicine, education. Belief leaks out. It always has. And when beliefs aren't built on evidence, they become hard to challenge. They live outside accountability. That's not just an individual problem, that's a cultural one. You'll see this most clearly when religious ideas clash with rights, whether it's in debates about reproductive freedom, gender identity, education standards, or health care. Often, what stands in the way of progress isn't data or logic. It's dogma, the kind that can't be reasoned with because it doesn't come from reason in the first place. And that's why handling religious arguments well does matter, not just on a personal level, but socially, because ideas shape the world we all live in. And if we let the most fragile or unexamined ones take up all the space, the consequences don't stay in someone's head. They show up in laws, policies, and power structures. That doesn't mean everyone has to agree, but it does mean ideas should be held to the same standards. If you can't explain it, if you can't question it, if it doesn't hold up under scrutiny, maybe it doesn't belong in the public square. Now, in all this, it's easy to fall into the trap of superiority, to feel like you've got the clearer view, the better reasoning, the facts on your side. And maybe you do, but that's not the point. The point isn't to be right, it's to be useful. And usefulness in these conversations comes from clarity, patience, and care. There's no need to ridicule or to corner someone intellectually. That almost never works. What works is asking the questions they've been avoiding, the ones they weren't taught to ask, the ones that pull the curtain back. Not all at once, but just enough to see that something behind it doesn't add up. And if someone gets defensive, that's okay. It means the conversation is touching something real. Just don't make it about ego. Let them sit with the tension. Let them think. That's where change starts, in that friction between belief and doubt. One question that often lingers for people stepping out of faith is, if not religion, then what? The answer isn't a replacement. It's a shift. Away from certainty toward curiosity. Away from answers handed down toward questions we explore together. That's not a downgrade. That's growth. It means ethics grounded in empathy, not commandments. Wonder grounded in science, not superstition. A worldview that adapts as we learn, rather than resisting every new idea that doesn't match the old story. And the story is old. Much of what religion offers was written for a world that no longer exists. A world without modern medicine, without the scientific method, without global communication. But we still treat these ideas as if they're timeless, as if Bronze Age moral codes should still guide nuclear age realities. That's not tradition, that's inertia. And inertia is only broken by asking, does this still make sense? Is this still helping? Is this still true? If the answer is no, then it's time to let it go. You can still honor the past without living in it. You can still respect someone's right to believe while questioning whether belief deserves authority. You can still value meaning, ritual, and community without pretending they require the supernatural. That's what handling religious arguments is really about. It's not about confrontation for its own sake. It's about clarity, about asking better questions, about creating a culture where truth matters more than tradition, and where belief is earned, not inherited. To become a member, visit our website, bert.com, and click on the blue button that reads, Click. So the next time someone starts with, well, I just believe, you don't have to push, you don't have to fight. You can just ask, why? And then wait. Because in the space that follows, in that pause, in that flicker of doubt, something new might begin.